Hey there. Let's talk about something really fundamental today. This whole idea of starting over, chasing that dream of a better life in a new country.
Yeah, it's such a powerful universal thing, isn't it? The hope for something different, maybe safer, maybe just more opportunity.
And it resonates with so many people. We want to explore this because you, our listener, shared a whole bunch of sources with us, articles, some research, personal stories, even a social media discussion, all looking at what this journey is like, well, right now, in 2025.
Specifically looking at places like the US and Canada, based on the materials you sent over.
Right. And what we found looking through these together is it's complicated. The dream is definitely still alive for many, but the path seems to be changing.
Absolutely. Opportunities are there, sure, but the sources also highlight some pretty significant hurdles, new challenges, policy shifts, stuff like that.
So that's what we want to do now, really get into these sources you shared, unpack the different layers, the policies, the economic stuff, but also the really personal side. What it feels like to be navigating all this as an immigrant today.
Okay, so where do we start? I think one of the first things that really jumps out from these materials is this trend. Some places that maybe felt more open before, they seem to be getting more restrictive.
Yeah, that comes through loud and clear. And it's not just one or two places. The sources mentioned several countries, Canada, Mexico, the UAE, Japan, even the UK, reportedly making things tougher.
Tougher how?
Well, things like higher visa fees, needing more documents, fewer options for staying long term, and maybe even just a shift in how people are treated, the general vibe.
And Canada specifically gets called out in one source. It used the phrase raising walls instead of bridges going into 2025, which sounds pretty dramatic.
It really does. And the
Yeah.
sources detail some very specific changes happening there, especially for international students. By mid-2025, there's this national cap on new study permits.
Right? Set at 437,000, I think the number was. And that's actually fewer than they issued the year before, so it's a direct limit.
Exactly. And tied to that, the amount of money students need to prove they have, it's shot up.
Yeah, I saw that. Doubled, didn't it? From around $10,000 to over $20,000?
Doubled. The idea, according to the sources, is to make sure students can actually afford to live there. But I mean, the practical effect is it's a huge financial barrier.
For sure. It could easily lock out students who are academically brilliant but just don't have that kind of cash up front.
And they're bringing in provincial quotas too, so regions get more say. The impact's already visible. One source mentioned a 31% drop in study permits for Indian students early in 2025 compared to the year before.
Wow, 31%. That shows how fast these policy changes can hit specific groups.
Definitely. And the reason given, the sources say it's because of the huge pressure on things like housing, healthcare, basic infrastructure.
Right, the system's straining.
Yeah.
The goal, apparently, is to cap the number of temporary residents, students, workers, asylum seekers at 5% of the total population by 2027.
Okay, but here's where it gets interesting, because the sources show this almost contradictory thing happening
Uh-huh.
while they're tightening up on temporary folks like students.
Yeah.
Another source talks about Canada planning to increase the number of permanent immigrants significantly.
Oh, right. The target was what, 500,000 new permanent residents a year by 2025? It's a big number.
A huge number. And the rationale is labor shortages, the population's aging. One source pointed out that 50 years ago, Canada had 7 workers for every retiree. Now it's like 3.
And heading towards just too soon, right? So they need people for the long haul, for the economy.
Exactly. So long-term economic needs are driving up permanent immigration targets, even while they're trying to limit temporary stays because of short-term pressures.
That sounds like a really tricky balancing act because, as the sources point out, they're trying to bring in more people permanently, but they're already dealing with this massive housing crisis and strained public services.
Yeah, one report mentioned refugees facing long delays just finding housing or getting paperwork done. It highlights the struggle to support the people already there, let alone integrating large new numbers smoothly.
It definitely feels like trying to solve one problem, the labor shortage, while maybe making another one, the infrastructure strain, even harder to manage. Not simple.
Not at all. Okay, so let's shift over to the United States. The sources you provided suggest some pretty major policy shifts and a climate of increased scrutiny there, too.
Yeah, under the current administration, what are the sources highlighting specifically?
Well, legislation-wise, there's mention of a big bill putting billions into border infrastructure, building more detention centers across different states.
And tied to that, setting really high deportation targets.
Yeah.
One source mentioned aiming for over 1 million deportations a year.
which they noted is roughly double the rate under the previous administration. So a clear focus on, enforcement and removal at a much bigger scale.
Okay. What else? Executive orders.
Yep. Orders giving broader enforcement powers. One allows removing certain non-citizens without a court hearing sometimes. There's also the attempt, which is being challenged in court, to redefine birthright citizenship through executive action.
And travel bans.
Those two.
Hmm.
Reinstating and strengthening bans for certain countries with what the sources call extreme vetting could include biometrics, financial checks, that sort of thing.
And then there's that law, the Laken-Riley Act. Several sources brought that up.
Right. That seems like a big one. It mandates detaining undocumented immigrants who are just charged with certain crimes. Not convicted, just charged. Held until trial or deportation.
That's a major shift. Detention based on accusation.
Yeah. And one source said over 22,000 people were detained under it within just 2 weeks of it starting. It shows how fast that policy impacted people.
Wow. Okay. Are there specific examples of how this climate is affecting people?
Yes, definitely. One really stark example from the sources involves Harvard University. The Department of Homeland Security, DHS, actually tried to strip Harvard's ability to sponsor student visas.
Seriously? Harvard? What happened?
It caused immediate panic among international students, obviously. One student quoted Alfred Williamson, talked about feeling dehumanized like he'd become an illegal alien literally overnight.
I can only imagine the fear. Losing years of work, your future just hanging by a thread.
Totally. He talked about that uncertainty, the anxiety rippling through the whole international student community there.
Did Harvard fight it?
They did. They sued. A judge put a temporary stop to it. But the sources say the case is still ongoing.
And it wasn't just Harvard. The administration is apparently also threatening visas for Chinese students more broadly.
That fits with some of the stuff in that Reddit thread you shared too, right? The feeling among some commenters that the U.S. is just riskier now. Yeah, definitely. People expressing concerns about an authoritarian shift, saying it's just not safe, mentioning folks getting detained or denied entry even with valid papers.
It creates this atmosphere of uncertainty, I guess. One comment even said the U.S. was put on some kind of civil liberties watch list.
That's what it said. Now, it's worth noting there was one person in that thread who had a really positive take, talking about their own success and the opportunities they found. So it's not monolithic.
But the overall feeling in that particular discussion seemed pretty wary, pretty negative about the current situation for immigrants and foreign nationals.
Exactly. It really highlights the psychological weight of all these policies, the constant uncertainty, even if you technically have the right documents.
So, okay, the policy environment is clearly getting tougher in some key places. But what about after someone arrives? What are the sources telling us about the day-to-day realities, the practical challenges?
Yeah, this is where the personal stories really bring it home. That account from Nicole, the American who moved to Portugal, it offers some really relatable insights into the adjustment process.
Right. She mentioned feeling welcomed, which is great, and appreciating the different pace of life, more family time compared to maybe a more work-centric culture back home. She loved the history, too.
Definitely positives.
Yeah.
But she also hit frustrations, like simple bureaucratic tasks taking hours. And the language, even knowing Spanish, Portuguese was tricky, and people just switched to English, which can be kind of isolating in its own way.
Yeah, it makes it harder to really integrate, doesn't it? And she missed things from home, too, right? Food, family,
Right.
the usual stuff.
Exactly, the emotional side of it. Plus practical things like getting used to relying on public transport instead of always having a car. It's a whole lifestyle shift.
And those kinds of challenges seem to echo what the sources say about assimilation difficulties in the U.S., too.
For sure. The process just to become a citizen, naturalization, is described as pretty austere and costly. There's a fee of, what, $1,170?
Yeah, that's not insignificant. So even the final step towards full belonging has a financial hurdle.
And beyond the money, there's the psychological burden. Going through that process while also trying to adapt to a whole new culture, maybe facing discrimination day to day, it adds up.
Plus, and this feels really important, the sources emphasize the trauma that many immigrants might already be carrying before they even arrived.
Absolutely. People fleeing violence or political instability or even increasingly climate disasters. That adds a whole other layer of difficulty to settling in.
That story about Valentina from Mexico was really powerful. Fleeing threats because of her environmental activism, dealing with climate disasters, and then facing even more dangers on the journey north, losing someone close in a flood.
It's heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And it just underscores how complex people's needs might be when they arrive. It's not just about finding a job and a place to live.
Which leads right into mental well-being. The sources point to the immense stress of these sudden life changes, the pressure cooker feeling of needing to succeed, and specific mental health struggles, especially among young immigrants.
Yeah, research mentioned shows that integration isn't automatic. It takes time, and it really requires strong support systems, including accessible mental health care.
And, crucially, support that understands the cultural context and speaks the language. The sources stress how vital bicultural and bilingual resources are because language barriers block access to so much, including therapy.
Totally. And language impacts jobs too, right?
Yeah.
Finding work is another huge hurdle the sources cover.
Yeah, especially in Canada. According to the materials, even highly skilled people, engineers, doctors, professionals, they can really struggle to find work in their actual field.
Why is that? What are the barriers?
Well, getting foreign credentials recognized is a big one. Proving your degree or license from back home is equivalent. Then there are expensive qualifying exams, lots of red tape.
And that demand for Canadian experience, right?
Yeah.
Even for jobs that don't seem to need it.
Exactly. It creates this catch-22. How do you get Canadian experience if no one will hire you without it? It leads to a lot of underemployment, people taking jobs well below their skill level, which is incredibly frustrating.
Okay, and we have to talk about housing again.
Yeah.
It keeps coming up in the sources for both the U.S. and Canada. It's just a massive challenge.
A huge one. In Canada, house prices apparently shot up faster than in the US, UK, or Australia recently, linked partly to low interest rates for a while, plus investors buying property.
So the basic need for a roof over your head becomes this primary obstacle. It's contributing to this feeling some people have that Canada's becoming unaffordable.
And the sources give concrete examples, high rents in Toronto, Vancouver, Halifax, Calgary. It really hits the wallet hard.
And it's similar in the U.S., obviously. Finding affordable housing, especially anywhere near decent jobs, is a major struggle for many, immigrants included.
Then there's healthcare access, particularly highlighted as an issue in the U.S. sources. Non-citizen immigrants are way more likely to be uninsured.
Yeah, due to rules like, for many legal permanent residents having to wait 5 years before they can even qualify for Medicaid, the low-income health program.
But it's not just eligibility rules, right? There's also fear.
Exactly. Fear that using any kind of public benefit, even health insurance they might be eligible for, could somehow jeopardize their immigration status down the line, especially with stricter enforcement policies.
That uncertainty even affects DACA recipients, the Dreamers. They recently got access to buy insurance on the ACA marketplaces, but there are legal challenges ongoing, so even that feels precarious.
Right. So even if you technically can get help, navigating the rules and overcoming that fear is a huge barrier. And the sources mentioned that even with clarifications about things like the public charge rule, many people are still confused or scared and just avoid seeking care they need.
Which obviously leads to worse health outcomes. It's a really tough picture overall.
It is. Tighter policies, big daily hurdles. But, the sources don't just focus on the negative. They also acknowledge why people still choose these countries and the support that is available.
That's important context. Despite everything we've discussed, Canada is still seen by many as fundamentally immigrant-friendly. Safety, diversity, universal healthcare.
Though, as we said, the sources add caveats: waiting times for healthcare, limits on things like dental or prescriptions.
True. But there's also free public school, K through 12, often with language support, like ESL classes. And there are still opportunities in certain job sectors, plus those bridge programs trying to help skilled immigrants get back into their fields.
And community stuff too, right? Festivals, community centers, trying to help people connect.
Yeah. And looking at the U.S., some sources still emphasize it as a place for big career moves, especially in cities like New York or San Francisco. That idea of the American dream, achieving success through hard work, it still pulls people in.
And that one positive personal story in the Reddit thread really drove that home for that individual. Plus, the economic contributions are noted: immigrant entrepreneurs, starting businesses, paying taxes, bringing new ideas.
And there are support systems. The sources mention things like newcomer centers, government language classes in Canada, LINC and CLIC settlement programs for job skills.
And in the U.S. discussion, there are calls for more accessible mental health support, citizenship tutoring, things like that, which acknowledges the need, at least.
And community support shows up too, like the Harvard students banding together, or just the general call you see in some reports for creating more welcoming environments.
So the bottom line from the sources seems to be, yes, it's tough. It takes planning, resilience, finding the right support. But people do make it work. They build lives, they contribute.
That determination, that human capacity to adapt and strive really comes through in the materials, despite all the obstacles.
Absolutely. And bringing it back to that human experience, it's just such an emotional journey, isn't it? The sources touch on the homesickness, the culture shock, figuring out who you are in this new context.
Yeah, dealing with feeling like an outsider, maybe facing prejudice, that's part of the reality. But so is the resilience, the drive to find belonging.
So, pulling all this together, thinking about everything in the sources you shared,
Yeah.
what's the main takeaway? For me, it's this really sharp contrast
Between what?
between that enduring dream opportunity, a better life, and the current reality, which seems to involve more hurdles, stricter policies, tough economic conditions like housing, and just the sheer emotional weight of it all.
Yeah, it's crystal clear from these sources that immigrating in 2025 is definitely not that simple. It's so complex, so layered, and intensely personal for everyone who goes through it.
It really leaves you thinking, doesn't it? Building on what we've discussed, how do these big forces, policy, economics, social attitudes, how do they actually shape not just where people end up, but maybe even who they become along the way?
That's a deep question. And related to that, maybe, what does it really take for us as a society to be genuinely welcoming, especially when it feels like some borders are tightening, but that fundamental human search for safety, for opportunity, for just belonging, that clearly hasn't gone away?